What I want to do today is talk to you about something that we often overlook. We talk about how to display quantitative data and how to graph that kind of information. But we don't often talk about how to display ideas, and yet you're expected to do that. And so I have a couple of ideas about that. I do have things about the graphic representation and color, but you probably can't see the red stripe going down the side either. No. So I'm not a fan of just a black and white representation. So I'm a little. No, I'm thinking we're buying a new projector. I'm putting the order in when we're done here. So the problem for today is how to convey ideas visually, which is, of course, ideas are abstractions, so that's an inherently difficult task to do. But when we have been successful at that, our graphic representations can enhance the meaning of whatever we're saying or what text we've written. The idea is that the figures that we draw should actually make our meaning more clear to either our audience or to the people who are reading our work. This is especially true when you don't have many words in a journal article to express yourself, or in a presentation where you usually don't have a substantial amount of time. So we rely on these aids, and the extent to which they can best convey our ideas is therefore really important to our ability to communicate. So I want to talk today briefly about how we can look at this in terms of a framework, in terms of a theoretical model, and in a theory, and in terms of a conceptual model that we would have. Maybe next quarter we'll do how to do graphs. This is I'm going to give you some examples of best and worst practices, but it's quite possible they might be all worst practices given this. So this is a conversation. Feel free to jump in the conversation here. And as we talk about this arises from a frustration on my part, because I see students struggle with this and see representations that are not as effective as they could be on this. So a starting point here is the idea that our images convey information, some of which we're intending, and some of it we may not be intending. And this, I think, is a good illustration of this point, because as soon as you see the top one, you're thinking of a progression, and it's evoking an idea that it's linear. We read this as going from left to right and unfolding in that manner. The bottom illustration, which is straight from Smart Art in PowerPoint, conveys a very different image, even without any words here. It's more dynamic. It's suggesting that things may not be linear, that there's a flow to things. So I think it's important that the image align with what you're doing. One of these is not necessarily preferable to the other. It's how it aligns with the ideas that you're trying to express. So we get a lot of mileage out of the top one. And it aligns pretty well with a lot of our statistical techniques that we're doing. But our ideas often are more fluid, and so I think I, for one, find the bottom one more interesting right off the bat. It's one of multiple things that you could do here. Other images that are elements here that are carrying a message would be the size of the boxes that we have here. Oftentimes that's driven by how much text we have to put in the box. But bigger conveys the notion to us more important. That may not be the case. The biggest box in what you're drawing may just be larger because you had more text to put in it. So these are important considerations to look at after you've got things put together in a rough sort of way, is to say, what is my image just as an image conveying? It might help to take the words out of it to do that. So this is familiar to everybody, right? We've all from the Carpiano and Daly article on framework theory and model. Terms I use very sloppily here. This is conveying two principles here that these terms differ in terms of the specificity and the scope of the model here. Whenever we read this in class, people ask me what that is. What is the area of overlap between the two? And I don't know. I mean, I think, what do you think about the overlap there?
I think it's conveying that it's fluid between framework and theory. So I mean, if it was like very distinct, then the framework would have a very distinct boundaries as well as the theories and models, but they don't.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to demonstrate that it's like fluid. I don't. Yeah.
Well, they don't say, but the introduction to this paper makes it very clear that these terms mean different things, which suggests that there shouldn't be any overlap between them. So I started thinking about this model, about moving these ovals aside, separate, so they didn't overlap. And then they look kind of strange that way. And I started wondering then why there are ovals there. What are those circles conveying, other than we have containers for our words? So we put our words in circles, we put them in boxes, we put them in triangles. We don't just have words hanging out there unless they're on bullet points. But in a graph like this, where I took them out. And let's see here. You're not seeing this also. It's in color, but it doesn't look like that. What do we think?
I mean, previously it went from larger circles to smaller circles.
Mm-hmm.
So in the one without the circles, you can't tell that framework is larger than theory and model as easily as the previous one.
Okay.
To me, it's not clear in this one that framework does not include theory and model, that it's distinct.
Ah, okay.
Because you could read it as, framework is everything including theory and models.
In this one, though, I think it's much clearer that the scope of framework is less specific and it has greater scope, right? So the actual arrows in the graph, you can place it within this dimension of scope and specificity.
Interesting. I was wondering if you could use, I don't like the circles. I don't like I don't like the round part of this.
Boxes.
Well, I thought about that. But the box didn't seem to,
It looks weird.
maybe triangles?
Dr. Anderson, what about the idea that you have a framework and then you apply theory to a framework, right? So like the social ecological model, then you apply theory. So there is some overlap. You have your framework and then you attach theories to it. So in some ways, it's sort of depicting that. You know,
Okay.
they're not completely separate
Mm.
things.
I'm going to work on this. I think what you're suggesting suggests that framework and theory are maybe perpendicular to each other. That a framework fits into a theory. But I'll try. We'll see what we come up with this. The ambiguity, though, is here in this image, because I do get this question every year, and we're speculating about what it means. Stephanie, maybe in that case I would see theory as contained within.
Well, or maybe it shows the connection, as Stephanie was saying, that there is a connection between framework and theory, and then theory and model. With model like being an instant of a theory, and the theory being
Yes.
always, usually as part of a larger framework, but it's not. So I think maybe that's what the overlap shows.
What if you did the circles, vertically? Because without the boxes, what I thought was nice is when you look at framework, theory, and model, there's stratified by height, right? So then more abstract is higher, less abstract is lower. So then by moving this vertically, you still keep that, but with the circles overlapping, it still demonstrates that like one is
Mm-hmm.
part of the other. They're all interconnected.
This is pretty much it's a very close approximation of theirs. The words in theirs, framework, theory, and model, go down like that. I thought they might have been on a level plane, but they're definitely giving you the same downward triangular effect there. All right. I'm going to try triangles on it. What I don't like here with this, which is, who said square? Square. I don't like this either.
The empty space.
The empty space is here. So what we are showing is evident, but what we're leaving out too is part of what we're communicating. So when I look at this one bothers me. Those empty spaces there, I don't want them to be empty. We would see it maybe even more clearly if these were in color, but because they're transparent so that you can see the overlap, you don't see so much the blank space there. But what are you if you're in between there? All right, well, redesigns of this. You send me your redesigns.
You'll
We'll
forward
send them
them
on. We'll send them on, yes, on that. Okay, this is following a principle that I like to follow, is if you don't need boxes and you don't need outlines of shapes and can do without them, that's a good thing. All right, so I wanted to talk about a framework, and oh, that's terribly focused. And also, you really can't tell how hideous the colors are in this. The colors on this go from blue to pink to yellow. So you're missing the exosystem is pink,
So weird.
and the center one is green.
Wow.
It's weird that it's reading like this.
Yes, it's not okay.
It's weird.
Share with you.
So I picked this one. Many you may know. I took my first social science class from Bronfenbrenner. It leaves me with a fondness for things that were developed out of his shop. As I worked for him for a while as a graduate student, it was just a very exciting, charismatic person. Could lecture to a hall of 500 people and keep them interested. I aspire to that. But I've actually given up 100, CHS 100. I think hoping never to teach that again. So what I wanted to bring up with this one was, in fact, the colors. And the colors on this really get at a rainbow of really primary colors. They're bright, they're vivid, and they shouldn't go next to each other. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be used, but not next to each other, and not as the dominant kind of focus here. Okay, there's a lot going on here, and even if it was in better focus, it's very difficult to read it. What I'm going to suggest to you is something that this is one variant on it that is not entirely satisfactory, but it is using colors that coordinate with each other and that go with a gray background. So some people like a blank background. I don't like a white background because a white background gives you a fair amount of glare. Exceeded only by like a yellow background. You don't want a bright color in the background. It compromises what you can do with other features here. So what do I like about this display here? You can read what's on it. So in the preceding one, you have things that are written in ways that, while they're informative, they're very difficult to read. This one, for those of you where we haven't gotten through Bronfenbrenner's framework in whatever our class number is, 270, I guess. The important points here of the framework is really critical points of it is that the individual is embedded in environments that are embedded within each other, and that the influence across these levels are interactive. And so in this graph, what I've tried to do is include, in addition to the figure itself, is the statement of what's important about it, as distinct from only representing that. I've also done something here which you really can't see now, so I would change this. Person and macro system should be highlighted in this because that was what I wanted to talk about. the idea that people, the specific example that I have in mind is one that Annie Fehrenbacher is working on for her dissertation. The idea that the restructuring of jobs in the labor market in the U.S. has an impact on individuals' quality of life. So the macro level change is the increase in job security that comes with jobs that people don't know if they're going to continue to be employed, where there's no long-term engagement between the employer and the employee. So, I'm looking at these colors. I'm looking at them on the screen. They're really nice on the screen, but they're appalling up here. The sometimes I get really irritated at things like this. I'm irritated at it. So this is a representation of an ecological systems theory. So the kind of framework here, but when you're applying it in your study, you can have this representation of it, but I think you want to, in fact, personalize it so that it is suited to what you're doing. The image is a simple one. It's easy to grasp, and so it just needs to be labeled. But then you want to say something about it, and you're going to be using it in your study. And that's why I think you would want to emphasize a particular point in it. And you could well do that here with color and linking the even the colors of the text to the colors of the system.
I think what you could also do here is, because color is not only to be pretty, but to give it more of a function,
Mm-hmm.
you choose colors in a way that show kind of like a, I was just thinking like when you look in a cup, so with the person being at the center, where you use the colors that show depth in.
So
of the
which
model.
colors would you use here, Lena?
I would probably use one base color in different shades, and use lighter to dark or the other way around. I would play around with that. From the top, I would have to try.
I thought about one set of colors. I was having trouble coming up with enough different colors here without it having the rainbow image on it. The single color is blurring the distinction between the levels. And so the levels are distinct, but it gives you the depth. A gradation of, if I skip ahead here.
The computer is a bit in the screen.
This is an example of what Lena's suggesting here, where I've just used three colors. It was challenging to get the three gradations here where they were still visible without an outline around them. So you could, if you used an outline around it, you can use, I think, finer gradations here and still be able to see them. These were, at least when I was working on it on the screen, the lightest and clearest differentiations here. So here I'm trying to convey an idea that's related to a gradient because it's talking about a statistical interaction. That's that the effect of X on Y is moderated by M here, so that across the values of M, the relationship between X and Y is going to be stronger to weaker. So from the stress literature, for example, the impact of stress on depressive symptoms decreases as a person's sense of mastery increases. So,
Why wouldn't you want to use outlines on the arrows? Just because you don't want to, or?
yeah, I don't like them. So they're actually they're busy. There's a busyness to it.
Because I was thinking with the circles, maybe you could do monochromatic, but then outlines might give you that sense of boundary.
Right. I think if you did the monochromatic for that one, for the ecological model, I think you would need boundaries around it in a monochromatic way. So there's a representation of it that has no color. And that one's very unsatisfying because it's flat. It has a flatness to it. So I like the dark to light, envisioning it, but you're right, it would have to be played with.
Mm-hmm.
So if you use, if you look at the arrow behind, that's pointing up, so I've used a different kind of arrow to show the interaction here. So arrows, different arrowheads can be shifted around to signify different things. You can see that that arrow, the outline on it, is an additional busyness in this. If I had spent more time, I think if you don't put an outline on this one, you lose that little bit of a tail on it. This area here, if I spent more time on it, I would have drawn the whole arrow myself so that these were bars here, so that it would additionally be conveying the sense that this is magnifying or diminishing the effect of this variable. I like that idea without this. So this is something I've used on occasion. Not everybody likes it, the gradations like that. I think you can get it if you have this potentially broken into pieces, which it automatically gives you here. But envision 3 of these up here with this around them. It's a lot of lines. So if I put these arrows up here, I would probably do them this way without an outline on it too. So this is the color here to indicate magnitude, and you're would use it in the other one to signify embeddedness
Yeah.
or
layers.
distance, layers.
Or depth or something like that.
So layers is a good thing to think about with the ecological model, because things are essentially layered that way. They're pretty distinct. What I wouldn't ever do up here on this one is use any kind of hatch marks or stuff to separate these. So in terms of ways to differentiate things that we would use on like a bar graph or something like that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Like a grid. The lines that go diagonally.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
you wouldn't use that.
No.
Like the different, there's like lines, dots, like full color
Filling.
background.
The filling of bars.
Okay. But
I didn't know that was called a hatch.
Cross-hatching is like when you're actually drawing, is how you shape things.
So what I was wondering is, with these models, it's usually also about the interactions between the layers or between the levels. And I wonder how one could represent that, because that's kind of missing in here, or
Yeah.
in fact in any other model that graphic display that I've seen.
I've seen a couple of these that have arrows here. So you could put an arrow like that. But it doesn't really convey what you would like to convey, I think, with that. So if you have arrows between these layers, you need them all the way like this too. Because the key idea here is that this might have an effect right here. So it may go through these, or it may go over them. Doesn't necessarily be mediated through each of those levels.
But you wouldn't want that with the arrows here.
Oh, no, you couldn't put that in. You can't put that in there. So, these, I did want to go over what some of the conventions are for marking conceptual models. And you don't always see this, but it's, I think, appropriate because of the relationship to structural equation modeling to signify constructs with a circle and measure variables as a rectangle or a square. You can see here the difference where I've got the outline on the one. I didn't take that off. You have to take the outlines off. They come automatically.
Okay, so measured variable would just be square, but no.
Right, so you see the square around it. I just think the square is unnecessary, the outline on it. And it's competing then with other arrows and things that you're drawing. But then your color has to be dark enough that it's going to show up in black and white. So that's a consideration with all of these that you do, even if you're doing for a publication where the publication is going to be in color. People are going to print it in black and white, and so you have to be able to see that. I was noticing that in today's class, that people had printed the one set of pastel colors out in black and white, and the effect is really muted in those particular drawings because they're all pastel, although it looked like an Easter egg basket to me, the original on that. So with regard to arrows, the two-headed arrows are misunderstood. They're often used to indicate that there's a bidirectional influence going on, but usually we restrict these really to show that there's covariation, and usually covariation that we're just setting it to the side. If we mean that there's a reciprocal relationship going on, we use the bidirectional arrows on the left side to show that X is influencing Y and Y is influencing X. Will you see people use it differently? Yes, but this convention, the use of a convention like this allows you to not have to say, this is a bidirectional influence. This is just covariation. That's the whole reason to have conventions like this. So on the bottom, I'm showing two alternative ways that are very popular for showing interaction effects. So the interaction effect, like the one I skipped ahead to, is the idea that the relationship between two variables is conditional on a third variable. And so the arrow is, the conditional effect is shown as going to an arrow and not to a set of variables. I've been using the one to the right because people misread the arrow to the left. It's a, this is the board, isn't it? I can write on this. I'm conditioned from being in the classrooms where if you do that and you write on the board, you might actually be writing on the screen. And I did that in the last quarter. I was joking about it because I almost did it all quarter. And somebody gave me not a dry erase. They left not a dry erase one up there, but a permanent marker. I mean, I can only assume that somebody did it deliberately. But I didn't, I just, there was a statistics class in there before me, and I let whoever think that it was that class that had done the damage. So, we have neon colors for this too. When you're drawing an arrow going straight to that, people very frequently interpret it as meaning being the same thing as that. That's why I like the circle here. Sometimes people put an X there.
Why do people interpret it that way?
Because they're not paying enough attention to the graph. So it's, and then you have M here. And so they're just sort of, especially if you have a moderator that you're not saying is related to Y, it's easily misread as that.
You're not always talking to like stats savvy people. Right, so you might not know.
Which leads us to why you need a key. Even if you're using conventions like this, this particular, so this is a model. Moving on to a theory, it's hard to talk about the stress process model as a theory when we're distinguishing it from model. But there is a theory, and then there is a conceptual model that goes with it. So let's look at this one. Here, it's a simple model, yet it's a complicated one. The value of this particular model when it was first articulated was that it specified a system of relationships here. Whereas previously, and we'll appreciate that from this morning's discussion of throwing everything into the regression code model, previous to that, all of this was treated as if in regressions to increase the amount of explained variance in mental health without regard to the role that the variables were playing in it. And that's an important consideration here because we have a set of mediators here. And so people were interpreting, people had psychosocial mediators in their models, but were interpreting the effects of life events and chronic stressors when these were in the model as if they were confounders. Okay. Instead of mediating variables. So to go through this model here, there are three main components to it: stressors, resources, and mental health. We have within the stressors category here relationships between two different kinds of stressors. Now there are multiple kinds of stressors that people look to, not just life events and chronic stressors. But in this first articulation of the model, it was the connection between these two, which was an important innovation because prior to that time, people treated stressors as if they were independent. And they said, no, they're organized in people's lives. So this component here is an important addition. And then we have the set of resources here: social resources, personal resources, and coping behaviors. I could draw a model here that had lines from all three of these going to here, and from both of these to each of these, and then from all of these to over here. And we have then arrow proliferation in this, and that's the reason that I grouped these together into categories of resources simply so that I can have a single arrow here conveying that these resources are thought to affect mental health and to be affected by exposure to stressors. So we have a mediated effect here, and I've shown that on the key for this, because an important part of it is the idea that the occurrence of stressors either mobilizes resources or depletes them, and therefore affects mental health. So in the exposition, in the text that goes with this particular figure, I'm explaining what a mediated effect is. And so in the text, I'm saying it's A times B. Ordinarily, you wouldn't need that on here, but it was part of the explication of the model that I was giving. And therefore, these are here, otherwise I would do without those. It occurred to me yesterday that I could have put AB over here and it would be even clearer for that. Here you see that I've used that circle on the end to show effect modification, the moderator. I've put it in a dashed line too, simply because there are so many lines going on. So in order to separate the moderation from the mediation, I've used a different line in addition to the difference in the arrowheads. Sometimes when I did do this, I use different arrowheads here too to distinguish the mediated effect. It's a simple model, but it's also complex when you're attempting to look at all the conditions with it. So stressors might have an effect on their own, but a key element of it is that resources moderate that effect, so that people who have a sense of mastery or who have a strong sense of social support tend to have, when stress comes along, it's not that they're unaffected by it, but they're less affected by it than are people who feel that they're at the mercy of the whims of the world, or that they're not connected to other people, or other people don't care about them. So that kind of moderation is a very important part of this model. I don't have any covariation going on there, do I? No.
Which is a bit confusing because I
Yes.
was looking for it. Where is the
Oh, well, there's a mistake. I'm not going to look at the paper to see if that one got through. At some point, I had something in there like that.
And the arrowheads are the same, just FYI.
Oh, are they? Oh,
Huh?
Not unmediated.
In the graph itself, they're the same as the
Yeah,
other
but
ones.
it's not actually.
Just-
set.
Well,
Here.
hopefully this is not the last version of this that went into print. Oh, okay, that's just indicating for our purposes that there was that A and B. But this is something that you can use in terms of animation of what you're doing, where you might not want something up there for the entirety of what you're talking about, but you want to call people's attention to it. A little animation goes a long way. A lot of animation, like a lot of color, is counterproductive at some point on that. This one is extending that model, that theory, to a conceptual model, and is doing that by specifying particular aspects of life events, of chronic stressors that are being used in this particular study. So that we have life events, disruptive life events, the idea that these lead to the occurrence of chronic stressors. But in this particular study is concerned with disruptive job events and their effect on income loss and economic strain. An important finding of this study was that these disruptive job events had less of an effect on chronic stressors among people who had greater personal and social resources. So we have, in each case here now, you see how to go back to the framework, the theory, and the conceptual model. In this case, in terms of the theory, we're talking about general principles here, that life events can lead to the occurrence of chronic stressors, and that these two forms of stressors can erode people's resources, and so forth. But in the specific conceptualization here has to do with jobs, economic loss, and stress that goes around. It's not only that people lose their jobs or have a demotion and they have less money as a result of that. Their economic strain goes up. So economic strain is influenced by income, but it's not the same thing as income. So up at the top there, I have it based on Perlin, 1981. So this is an adaptation of the figure that appeared in that article. And so that makes it appropriate to say it's based on it. It's not a replication of it. I haven't taken the one they had. If you do use somebody's model from a paper, you do have to get permission to do that from the journal. It's polite to ask the person for it too, but you have to get it from the journal, and they often charge you for that. So this is based on that model. It's actually an improvement. But sometimes it's, you would say, adapted from. So this is a model from my text, and I see this one now that people have used it and adapted the figure to that use without citation. It irritates me. You don't want me irritated. Definitely not. What I want to show you here is a question that comes up frequently, which is supposing I have a model and a conceptual model theory that's much more expansive than what I'm actually doing in the study. So in this case, I lay out a set of different kinds of variables, but it's rare that you would have all of this in one study. I found a few examples of it, but you can present the entirety of a model like this and then present what you're actually doing in the study. Here I've just taken those elements out. Another thing you can do is make them fade into the background, so they're still there, but they're ghosted. I was not willing to do that yesterday. Here, I've outlined for you some of the functions of color, and I want to go back and illustrate just one of them here. In this particular slide here, I'm using the difference in color to show the difference between the moderator, but I'm also showing you here that I mean this moderator and this moderator have something in common, that they're showing the same thing. So I'm using the color there to show what's different and to show a similarity there. So I've outlined for you some of the functions of color. And as you were saying, I would put the making it look pretty or the decorative aspect of it as the least important thing that you're doing with the color. You're really trying to use the color to link things together, to provide a sense of coherence to the model, to draw distinctions between different aspects. And so you want to use the color that way, the 4 colors that you're limiting yourself to. After 4, I think you're up to color over saturation on a figure. So if you set yourself at 4, if you went to 5, it wouldn't be a disaster. But if you're at 7, it's way too much going on, which I've tried to illustrate here. Oh, this isn't showing. It's red, it's brown, it's purple. It's will be sent to you. All right, in this one is actually a good illustration of the use of color, but you're going to have to look at it. The violent categories are done in red, and I've used red because it's that's great.
So the one that we sent, I think we can actually see the
that's
color.
good.
I think those colors.
Next time we'll just bring our computers. We'll forget about the screen. I've used red because it's violent, and I wasn't so sure about a color for the non-violent, but settled on blue for it, because this lets you track the transitions very clearly, where people are changing from becoming violent to non-violent, or the other way around. This is from June Leem's dissertation, where she was looking at these transitions from adolescence to young adulthood. She's also used different shapes there for the turning points. I've linked there's a turning point that is onto a course of more violence. So I've linked the red with the red there. And for the turning point to nonviolence, I've linked the blue to the blue. But I'm using the same shape for the turning points, even though they're in opposite directions, because I want to convey the same thing. They're a change in direction in the course of somebody's life. I changed, in June's version of this, she's got she's used the same form for violent, nonviolent, for the relationships, for friends, and with parents and the like. And I switched that out with ovals here. I'm not sure I'd settle on that as a final form, but I did not want this to have the same shape as this.
Which makes sense because these are outcomes, right? Not violent and violent.
Yes.
Whereas the others are more like things that play a role in those outcomes.
Yes. This is, I think, is a good shape for the idea of a turning point. It's an unusual shape. I wasn't so hot on the ovals here, but I was getting on a plane. These lines, I think something could be done with the color of the lines to lend a little more coherence to the figure. But this was one of the more successful ones for conceptualization, I think, of such a complex problem, which is this on, off, as it plays out over time. Up at the top, from early childhood to adolescence, I would have, I think, moved adolescence closer to childhood and maybe made the maybe it goes the other way, that adolescence should be closer to early adulthood. I guess that would make more sense because she's talking about the transition to adulthood, that movement of this equals distance here is not necessarily, it's conveying the same passage of time. And this is a bigger passage of time than this. So it's a bit, but maybe you wreck the whole thing if you rescale that. So the scale of things, and as I said in the beginning, when something's bigger, we think it's more important. When lines are equal like that, we say it's the same thing. This is from June's dissertation too, and while it's not a conceptual figure, it's, so I'm cheating on this. I've moved over to the display of data. What I like about this one is it's actually a complicated idea to convey here, but she's looking at the extent to which taking parental closeness into account changes people's trajectory of violence. And she's comparing people who are at the minimum level of parental closeness to people who are at the average level or mean level of parental closeness. And for our purposes, the important parts of this are these two lines are linked together by color, but they're distinguished from each other by virtue of having, well, they both have the same shape. One is filled in, one is open. That's important when this is printed in black and white. These two things connect these things, and the dashed line open here corresponds to the dashed line open here. So both of these we understand to be the mean level, and we understand the solid lines in both cases to be the minimum level. So this is a particularly effective use of both the symbols and the variation in the lines and the variation in the color to convey the sense of things being alike and different. And they're alike and different from the top compared to the bottom, in addition to being at the bottom or being at the top. We did that. Okay, I think this is just, I think this is the final one, yes. This is not on color, but on the idea that with using text in different ways, you can draw distinctions that you don't have to shout about. They can be subtle kinds of distinctions. Obviously, if you're doing caps or caps in lowercase, that differentiates concepts. The bigger concept, the more important one, you probably put in all caps. Subsidiary things you might put in upper and lowercase. Italics, bold, or emphasis. I like to use shadows. The shadows oftentimes give an emphasis without being as heavy as bolding something. Of the accents, I think the lightest accent is italics, and the heaviest one is bold. And then the one I like at the bottom is small caps. It is a way of, it's a sort of formal print type representation that differentiates itself even from all caps. So these are ways to use variants on the text to take the font on the top of this one is a lot fancier than the one on the where you see contrast. So one is much more modern. The other is more formal in its connotation. They make a nice contrast and tension when used together, but they don't say to you, "Look at me." They just say, your eye reads them as being different. Okay, that's what I have to say about this. I'm going to have to redo some of these, I can see. I'm not using this projector again. Questions, comments? Are you going to work on the Carpiano one? Are you going to work on the Carpiano one?
Think about it. But I feel like with these graphs or just like graphics in general, you're never done. Because at least that's how I feel. At some point, I just have to stop myself because it gets into you can go crazy with that stuff. Because it's never perfect and you always see something that's not quite, the way it's supposed to be.
For my analysis book, I have no idea, countless hours on the graphics for it, and they messed them up. When I sent them in, I said, these are printing differently depending on the printer and the computer. You have to somebody has to address this in the figures. Don't worry, through all of the stages to it. We'll fix it when we do the proofs. And I thought, you're not going to fix this when you do the proofs, but they wouldn't. And then when it got to be the proofs, they said, we're not fixing that. And which led to one of the worst meltdowns that I've had ever. And I don't like to look at the book as a result, because the graphics are not what I sent them. And so yes, you have to at some point say this is good enough. The stress process one, I wrote 4 different papers that had variants of the model in it, and for particular reasons. And because it's okay, I'm really skilled at not plagiarizing myself when it's text. I mean, I can sit down and take text that's the method section for something and make it different in the course of an hour. But it's a much harder job to make figures look different from each other. So I did really get into some pretty elaborate schemes for the stress process on that.
Can you not just cite yourself when it comes to graphs? Like just.
Oh yes, but if it's appeared in print, you have to get permission to
From the publisher?
From the publisher to reproduce the graph, even if it's your own.
And even if you cite it, I mean, that's
Yes.
That's annoying, I imagine.
Yes.
Well, it seems like, you're writing your methods, and it's like something I've been challenged with, writing about the same methods in like 5 different
Yeah.
papers. They don't sound all that different, but you try. But I mean, you spend a lot of time making this visual depiction of your model or your theory. How many different ways you want it to be like? This is the perfect way. It doesn't
Well,
make
if you've got the
sense.
perfect way, then you ask the journal for permission. You pay them. It's usually a fee. If it's your model, if it's yours,
Mhm.
they may give it to you cost free,
Mhm.
or they may charge you $100 for it if you're a student.
For your own thing, that's just weird. For your own thing, you have to pay.
You don't own
to use it.
you don't own the copyright to it. When you write, the words are no longer yours. They're the publisher's.
Mm.
And that's the reason to not write it exactly the same way, because they own the copyright on it, even in the methods section. And
And I've taken to merging my documents to making sure.
oh,
Yeah.
I don't go that far. I just change. I think it's sufficient if you change it first. I mean, obviously, you're not going to be citing results that same way and the like, but I satisfy myself with changing a word or so in the sentence.
And not changing the whole sentence structure.
Sometimes they change the whole structure, but I'm working with the idea that you're just not reproducing it exactly.
Okay. That's good to hear.
But changing the sentence structure is not that hard to do. Inverting the beginning and the end, the second part of the sentence. Changing the tense.
We should have a separate session on that.
Yeah.
Like things,
Well,
when
people.
you publish.
Yeah, I think growing up, I heard, but earlier in my career, I heard it's okay to use your same language because it's yours for methods because it doesn't change since being here. I've heard.
Well, I think it's changed. I think it is actually changed, and the reasons it's changed is because you can search and you can run software for detecting plagiarism. And so once you've been through an experience where there's been plagiarism,
Mhm.
then you don't. You're careful not to do that.
That makes sense.
But it doesn't. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be radically different. I mean, method sections are different. When you're expressing the ideas in a paper, it should be the case that each paper you're doing has a new idea in it. Is some of the text going to be the same, or you're covering parts of it are going to be the same. If you're describing the stress process model, you're going to talk about mediators, you're going to talk about moderators, but the particulars of what there ought to be a new thing that you're presenting in the introduction of the paper. The results should be different. I only know so many ways of describing results where you're saying what happened to regression models is you add variables to the model, but they're not identical.
I know right now I'm working on a paper that is an outcomes of that corner store project, but we already have an outcomes paper. So we have one of the community, using a community sample, and one of patrons of the stores, and with the same outcomes. And so, like, I am struggling to write the same things with very similar findings with two different samples. You know, like one paper is already under review and it's a new one, and I'm like, oh my god, this will sound too much like this, because there's only just so many ways you can say, like, it wasn't scared for it. I'm just saying it's
Right.
I get it.
When it's for publishing, you mentioned like the methods, like let's say in one word or something, but then you also mentioned like software to detect plagiarism, and I know like Turnitin.com, like I work with that, and but that one, like if you only change a word, it like very quickly detects it. So then your suggestion of like just changing the second half to the first half, like for example, it would still detect that. Because they're like the same groupings. So,
But if you look at the two of them then, and then they're by the same author, and it's describing the same study, and the language varies a little, but it's not identical, I don't think people have a problem with that at all. They have a problem with taking the words verbatim and having no changes in them whatsoever. They have a lot of trouble with taking somebody else's description of the study verbatim, even if you edit it. So somebody else has described the HRS study, or you go to the website and you get the description of the HRS study, you better be citing that. And I see students not cite that all the time. I'm reading something right now where I'm going, citation, 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 citation. Where'd you get this information from? Well, I got it from the write-up and description of the study. Well, you can say these methods, the description of these methods is all based on this website, this documentation, this book. But you have to say where you got it from. You weren't even there. If you're doing a secondary data analysis, you weren't there to see what happened. You were here for that study, so you can write a first-person account of it. But otherwise, it's a second-hand account of it. So if I change up that description and don't make an attribution, don't make a blanket citations to it, that's a case of misrepresentation.
So, with regard to like working on your dissertation or like your thesis from your master's, say you didn't do like the 3 paper course, you just have this very long paper, right, with all these chapters. Can you, since you didn't really submit for like peer review, but then it was still published in like a database of like dissertations and theses, can you not like, do you have to like reword those things, or?
You mean from your dissertation, you're publishing the paper from your dissertation? Can you take it straight from your dissertation?
Like chunks.
Yes.
So that would be okay, but then subsequent.
Well,
things
you've
you-
copyrighted your dissertation.
Unless you publish it as a book, right?
Unless you
So-
publish it as a book. If you were to publish it as a book and then write articles from it, you would want to be citing the book then.
Who does that? I mean,
Who does
public
what?
health people actually publish it in the book.
No, people in public health don't publish very many books.
Yeah.
period. I can't think of a dissertation I've seen as a book.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean there hasn't been one.
I mean, people do book
People do that.
dissertations,
But they don't publish it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
hard, I mean, it's hard to publish it.
It used to be the case that dissertations were published as books. Publishers published more research monographs than they do now. Research, if you go to sociology, though, you'll find people who are writing books for dissertations.
Yeah, and that
Or-
makes sense
It's
based on the
harder,
discipline, yeah.
If you're not doing empirical stuff, it's really hard to do a 3-paper thing, because if it's like if everything builds up to one big theory or conclusion, it's kind of hard to like split it into. I'm just thinking about sociology.
The 3-paper options for the dissertations seem to work better for some, particularly when people have different data sets that they're analyzing. The 3-paper option seems to work well. I can't really say, though, because I haven't had anybody do a 3-paper option.